Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the only fire you need to gather round for the most gripping legends of the American West. We spin the yarns of the brave, the broken, and the ones who sought a bloody redemption in the dust. Before we ride into the twilight with tonight's story, do us a kindness and subscribe to the channel, and make sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the telling of a single tale. Now, listen close, for the wind on the plains still whispers this one. The story of a love, a lie, and the widow who paid for both in blood. The sunset over the West Texas plains was a raw, bleeding wound in the sky. It bled across the vast, empty canvas of the horizon, staining the clouds in hues of crimson and bruised purple. The wind, a lonely and eternal wanderer, swept across the hard-pin earth, carrying with it the fine, red dust that was the territory's lifeblood and its shroud. It whispered through the sparse, thorny mesquite and sighed as it passed over the lonely, windswept cemetery that overlooked the town of Redemption. Here, among the tilted wooden crosses and the weathered stone markers, knelt a solitary figure. Abigail Kane was a woman carved from grief, her form a stark silhouette in the dying light. The black mourning dress she had worn for a month was now the color of the dust, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of sorrow. Before her was a fresh grave, the earth still dark and unsettled. A simple wooden cross bore the name, Elias Kane. Husband, son, friend. The words were a monument to a life that had been a sun, and whose extinguishing had left her in a cold, dark, and silent universe. In her palm, she clutched the simple gold band of his wedding ring. It was still warm, or so she imagined, from the heat of his hand. She rolled it between her thumb and forefinger, the smooth metal of final, painful connection to the man who had been her world. A single tear, then another, traced a path through the grime on her cheek, falling to the thirsty earth of his grave. She closed her eyes, and the memory, the one she had tried to scream and claw her way out of every night for 30 nights, returned with the force of a physical blow. It was an ambush, a cowardly trap on the trail back from selling their cattle. The crack of the first rifle shot, the high, terrified scream of a horse. Elias, pushing her from her saddle, his face a mask of fierce, protective love. "Ride, Abby, ride," he had yelled. But she hadn't. She had frozen, her husband's old revolver heavy and useless in her hand. She saw it all in disjointed, nightmarish flashes. The faces of the men, leering and cruel, led by a man whose features were a twisted, hateful mockery of her husband's own. His brother, Caleb. Elias fought like a cornered lion, his Colts a blur of motion, a dance of death against impossible odds. But there were too many. A bullet took him in the side, another in the leg. He fell to one knee, still firing, still fighting. The final shot, the one from Caleb's own gun, took him in the chest. He collapsed, his eyes finding hers across the dusty ground, a look of shocked, silent apology in them. She had run to him then, the outlaws' laughter a mocking chorus as they rode away, leaving them to the vultures. She had cradled his head in her lap, his blood soaking her dress, her hands trying desperately to hold in the life that was pouring out of him. "I'm sorry, Abby," he had whispered, his voice a ragged breath. "I'm so sorry." "Don't talk," she had sobbed. "Save your strength." But there was no strength left to save. He had looked at her one last time, his hand weakly clutching hers, and then the light in his beautiful blue eyes had simply gone out. He had died in her arms, under the cruel, indifferent Texas sun. The memory tore a low, wounded sound from her throat. She opened her eyes, the grief now burned away by something hotter, something harder. She looked at the simple wooden cross, at the name carved into it. Her love for him, once a gentle, warming flame, was now a white-hot, all-consuming forge. She slipped his ring onto the thumb of her left hand. It was too large, a constant, heavy reminder. Then, she placed her right hand flat against the rough wood of the cross, the splinters digging into her palm. "Elias," she whispered to the wind and the dust and the ghost of the man below. "I hear you. I'm sorry, too. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough. But I will be now." Her voice dropped, the sorrow hardening into a vow of cold, unbreakable steel. "I swear it on your soul. I swear it on the love we shared. They took you from me with blood, and I will answer in kind. Every last one of them, from the lowest dog to the serpent who led them. I will hunt them down. Blood for blood, my love." That is my promise." She stayed there as the last of the sun's light died, and the stars began to prick the black velvet of the sky. When she finally rose to her feet, the woman who had knelt there was gone. In her place stood something new, something forged in the crucible of loss and tempered in the fires of pure, righteous hatred. In her eyes, where tears had been, there was now a cold, hard, and dangerous light. The widow Kane was about to begin her journey, and it was a journey that would be paved in gunpowder and graves. The transformation of Abigail Kane began in the silence and the shadows. The town of redemption, a place that ran on whispers and assumptions, saw only a widow consumed by her grief. They saw her sell off the last of their cattle. They saw her dismiss the two ranch hands her husband had employed. They nodded sadly to each other in the general store and the saloon. "Poor woman's broken," they'd say. "She'll be gone by the first snow, back to whatever civilized place she came from." They were wrong. Abby wasn't selling off her assets to flee. She was liquidating them for a singular purpose: to fund a war. The money from the cattle did not go into a savings account. It went to a shady, back-alley gunsmith in a town 2 days' ride away. She returned not with a suitcase, but with a long, heavy crate filled with a matched pair of Colt Point .44 revolvers, a new Winchester repeating rifle, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. Her training ground was a secluded, box-ended canyon a few miles from the deserted ranch house. Her only audience was the buzzards circling in the hot, blue sky and the ghost of her husband, a constant, silent presence at her side. The first few weeks were an agony of failure and frustration. The revolvers, so light and balanced in Elias's hands, were heavy and unwieldy in hers. The recoil bruised her wrists and her shoulder. The roar of the gunfire was a physical assault, making her flinch, causing her shots to fly wide of the tin cans she had set up. Every missed shot was a fresh wave of self-loathing, a testament to the weakness that had allowed her husband to die. But the fire inside her, the fire lit by the vow at his grave, was more potent than her frustration. After every failed attempt, she would close her eyes, see his face, and reload. She worked with a grim, methodical fury. She practiced her draw over and over, until her arm was a screaming knot of pain, until the motion was no longer a thought but a reflex. She learned to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger with a slow, steady pressure, just as Elias had once tried to teach her in a happier time. Slowly, painstakingly, a change began. The shots started to land closer to the targets. The flinch subsided, replaced by a cold focus. The recoil became a familiar, predictable force. She began to move with the weapons, to feel them as extensions of her own will. The woman who had once arranged wildflowers was now arranging bullet holes in a tight, deadly pattern. She did not just practice shooting. She rode for miles into the Badlands, learning the terrain, finding the hidden water holes, teaching herself to live off the land. She became leaner, harder, the soft lines of her face and body giving way to the sharp, functional angles of a predator. The townsfolk began to notice the change. She would ride into redemption for supplies, her face impassive, her eyes holding a new and settling light. They were no longer the soft, gentle eyes of the woman who had organized church socials. They were watchful, direct, and utterly cold. The widow's got fire in her eyes, old Jed, the blacksmith, remarked to a customer, after Abby had bought a new knife and a whetstone. Her questions about the quality of the steel sharp and knowledgeable. The whisper began to spread through the town, a new narrative replacing the old one of pity. Her first target was a man named Grimes, one of the lower-level thugs in Caleb's gang. She learned from the hushed conversations in the saloon that he was a braggart and a drunk, who had been boasting about the easy money from the Kane ambush. She learned he had a fondness for a particular card game in a dusty, fly-blown cantina in a settlement called Perdition's Well. Abby rode out, not as a grieving widow, but as a hunter. She did not confront him in the cantina. That was a fool's game. She waited. She watched him for 2 days, learning his routine. She saw him win big at cards, saw him get roaring drunk, saw him stumble out of the cantina and ride off into the night, alone. She followed him, a ghost in the darkness. She did not challenge him on the open trail. She waited until he reached a narrow wooden bridge crossing a deep, dry arroyo. It was the perfect choke point. She rode ahead, took a position in the rocks overlooking the bridge, and waited, the new Winchester rifle cool and steady in her hands. When Grimes appeared, a sloppy, silhouetted figure against the moonlit sky. She did not call out his name. She did not offer him a chance. He had offered her husband no chance. She sighted down the long barrel, her breathing slow and even. She remembered his leering face from the day of the ambush, remembered his laughter. The fire inside her burned white hot. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The shot was perfect. Grimes was thrown from his horse, a single, dark hole appearing in his back. He landed in a crumpled heap on the bridge and did not move. Abby did not feel triumph. She did not feel relief. She felt nothing. A cold, hollow emptiness. She had taken her first life. She had paid the first installment on her vow. She turned her horse and rode back into the darkness, leaving Grimes's body for the coyotes. One was gone. The fire in her eyes had been answered with the first taste of gunpowder and blood, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was only the beginning. The death of a lowlife like Grimes barely registered as a tremor in the territory. Men like him died all the time in drunken brawls, over a card game, or at the end of a rope. The sheriff in Perdition's well ruled it a robbery gone bad and closed the case. But Caleb Kane knew better. When the news reached him, he felt a cold, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. An expert rifle shot, in the back, from a distance. The body left untouched, the money from the card game still in his pockets. This was not robbery. This was an execution. This was a message. Abby, however, did not wait for Caleb's reaction. Her vengeance had its own terrible momentum now. Her next target was a pair of brothers, the Miller boys, who had also ridden with Caleb. She learned they were using their blood money to run a small, crooked freighting operation, bullying their way through the territory. She tracked them for a week, her patience a cold, sharp tool. She learned their route, their habits, their weaknesses. She chose her ground a steep, winding pass in the Comanche Hills, a place where their heavy wagon would be forced to slow to a crawl. This time, it was not a clean shot from a distance. It was an ambush, up close and personal. She triggered a small rock slide, blocking the path ahead of them. As they cursed and climbed down from the wagon to assess the damage, she emerged from the rocks above them, a Colt in each hand. "Remember me?" she asked, her voice a low, chilling whisper in the mountain silence. They turned, their faces a mask of shock and dawning horror. They remembered the screaming woman from the ambush. They fumbled for their own guns, but they were teamsters, not gunfighters. They were slow, clumsy. Abby was not. 2 shots cracked the silence, echoing through the pass. The Miller brothers fell where they stood. 3 down. She searched their bodies and their wagon, not for money, but for information, for any clue that would lead her closer to the heart of the serpent, to Caleb. She found a ledger detailing their crooked business, and tucked inside it, a letter. It was from Caleb, giving the brothers their instructions. But it was a line at the end that made her pause. "Stay clear of Sangre de Cristo," Caleb had written. "That is Serafina's town now. My business with her is my own." Serafina. The name meant nothing to her. A woman's name. Probably one of Caleb's saloon girls. Abby dismissed it. Her mind focused solely on the hunt. She burned the wagon and rode on. Her next target was a man named Lefty Pete, Caleb's second in command, a weary, vicious man known for his skill with a knife. Finding him took her deep into the lawless borderlands, a place of desperate men and cheap whiskey. She found him in a filthy, smoke-filled saloon in a town that was little more than a collection of mud huts. She couldn't use force here. The saloon was filled with men who would side with Lefty without a second thought. She had to use her wits. She played the part of a lonely, vulnerable woman, new to town, catching his eye from across the room. He took the bait, his arrogance his undoing. He bought her drinks, his talk full of boasts and veiled threats. She let him believe he was seducing her. She let him walk her out into the moonless night, towards the promise of her rented room. In a dark alleyway, far from the light of the saloon, she turned to face him. "You were there," she said, her voice soft. "You held my husband's arms." Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a cruel, knowing smirk. He was a fool, Lefty rasped. Dying for a woman who wasn't worth it. Before he could say more, before he could even reach for his knife, she had her Colt out, the barrel pressed against his gut. "He died for me," she hissed, the fire in her soul flaring. Lefty laughed, a gurgling, ugly sound. "That's what you think," he gasped, the trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth as he looked down at the gun. "He didn't die for you, widow. He died for Serafina's love." His words were cut off by the deafening roar of the Colt. The lie, the desperate, dying insult, was silenced. She left him in the alley, his words echoing in her mind. "He didn't die for you." She rode away from the town, the wind cold against her face. It was a lie. A trick. The desperate poison of a dying snake, trying to wound her with his last breath. Elias had loved her. He had died for her. He had died in her arms. She knew what was real. But the whisper had been planted. Serafina. The name, once meaningless, was now a tiny, sharp burr, caught in the fabric of her certainty. She tried to pull it out, to cast it aside, but it clung there, a small, persistent irritant. Her rage, the pure, clean fire that had driven her, now had a tiny and welcome fleck of something else in it, the first, faint, and terrifying whisper of doubt. Returning to the ranch after the killing of Lefty Pete felt different. The familiar, comforting silence of the valley now seemed to hold an echo of the dying outlaw's words. "He didn't die for you." The whisper followed her, a phantom presence in the quiet rooms of her home. Abby pushed it down with a force born of desperation. She told herself it was a weapon, a lie crafted by her enemies to break her spirit. Her quest was righteous. Her love for Elias had been pure. His sacrifice had been for her. To believe otherwise was to invalidate everything she had done, to turn her bloody journey of justice into a meaningless, mad rampage. She could not, would not, allow that. She needed to focus. She needed to resupply and find the trail of the next man on her list. She rode into the town of redemption, the place that now felt more like a stranger's territory than a home. The change in how the townsfolk treated her was palpable. The pity was gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and a grudging, awe-filled respect. They no longer saw the fragile, grieving widow. They saw a woman who moved with a deadly purpose, her hand never far from the Colt on her hip, her eyes holding a cold, distant fire that made men look away. When she walked into the general store, the usual chatter died down to a hushed murmur. Men tipped their hats, but their greetings were strained. The women who had once brought her casseroles now gathered their children a little closer as she passed. She was an outcast, a pariah, a living embodiment of the violence that they all feared. She was the ghost of her own past, haunting the streets of her own town. "Heard you've been traveling, Abby," said Mr. Henderson, the store owner, his voice nervous as he measured out flour for her. "There's business to attend to," Abby replied, her voice flat, offering no explanation. "There are whispers," Henderson ventured, not meeting her eye. "Talk of the Miller boys and Lefty Pete. Whispers are for men with nothing better to do." Abby cut him off, her tone leaving no room for further questions. She paid for her supplies and left, the silence of the store pressing in on her back. Her isolation was now complete. She had her mission, her vow, but she was utterly, profoundly alone. Back at the ranch, she forced the whispers from her mind and focused on the hunt. Her list was growing shorter. There were only 2 men left now, besides Caleb himself. 2 men named Shoah and Finnegan, hired guns who had been the core of Caleb's muscle. Finding them would be difficult. They were professionals, not drunken thugs like the others. They would have heard of the deaths of their comrades. They would be watchful, wary. She spent a week poring over old maps, trying to predict their movements, trying to think like Caleb. Where would he send his 2 best men? Not to raid, not anymore. He would send them to hunt. To hunt her. The realization was a cold splash of water. She had been the hunter for so long, she had almost forgotten she was also the prey. They would come for her. They would come here, to the valley. The thought did not bring fear. It brought a strange, grim sense of relief. Let them come. She would turn her home, her sanctuary, into their tomb. For the next few days, she prepared. She studied the terrain of the valley with a new, tactical eye. The creek, the cottonwood grove, the rocky outcrops, they were no longer just features of a beloved landscape. They were defensive positions, ambush points, kill zones. She spent hours in the canyon, not just practicing her aim, but practicing shooting from cover, practicing moving from one position to another, reloading on the run. She was no longer just a marksman, she was becoming a soldier, preparing to defend her fortress. One afternoon, as she was cleaning her Winchester on the porch of the ranch house, she saw a lone rider approaching. It was old Jed, the blacksmith, the closest thing she had to a friend left in redemption. He rode up, his face a mask of worried lines, and dismounted. "Abby," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I need to talk to you." "I'm listening, Jed," she said, not looking up from her work. "The whispers. They're not just about you anymore," he said hesitantly. "I've heard a name. From a traveler who came up from the border towns. A woman's name. They say Elias. They say he used to visit a singer at a cantina in Sangre de Cristo. A woman named Serafina." Abby's hands went still. The name. The same name Lefty had gasped with his dying breath. Hearing it now, in the calm, steady voice of a man she trusted, gave it a weight, a reality, that she could not so easily dismiss. "It's a lie, Jed," she said, her voice tight, brittle. "A story Caleb is spreading to poison my husband's name, to break my will." Jed looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful pity. "Maybe," he said softly. "But the traveler. He said something else. He said Caleb Kane didn't kill his brother just for the ranch. He said Caleb wanted the woman for himself." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Abby stood up, her face pale, the fire in her eyes now a wild, desperate blaze. "Get off my land, Jed," she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage that was aimed as much at herself as it was at him. "Get off my land and don't come back. Do not speak his name to me again." Jed, seeing he had gone too far, raised his hands and slowly backed away. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Abby alone with the terrible, poisonous seeds he had planted. Serafina. Caleb wanted the woman for himself. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to put a bullet through the heart of the rumor itself. But she couldn't. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were a chorus, singing a song of betrayal that was becoming too loud to ignore. Her righteous quest was now tainted with the filth of a story she did not want to believe, a story that threatened to turn her sacred vow into a bitter, hollow lie. The seed of doubt, planted by Lefty Pete and watered by Jed the blacksmith, took root in the barren soil of Abigail's soul. She tried to rip it out, to starve it of the light, but it was a tenacious, thorny thing, and its roots were wrapped around the very foundation of her quest. The pure, clean fire of her vengeance was now choked with a black, acrid smoke. Was it possible? Could the man she had loved, the man for whom she had waded through blood, have been unfaithful? Her rage and her grief were now at war with this new, insidious poison. She found herself in a desperate, frantic need to prove it wrong, to kill the lie with the same finality she had killed the men who whispered it. The only way to do that was to finish her list, to get to Caleb, the source of the poison, and force the truth from him before she sent him to hell. Her focus returned, sharper and more brittle than ever. She knew Shoei and Finnegan, Caleb's last two lieutenants, were coming for her. She would not wait. She would go out and meet them. She would force the confrontation. She found their trail easier than she expected. They were good, but they were arrogant, leaving a clear track for anyone who knew how to look. They weren't just hunting her, they were making a show of it, letting her know they were coming. It was a classic hunter's tactic: rattle the prey, make them run, make them make a mistake. Abby did not run. She shadowed them. For 3 days, she was a ghost at their backs, always a ridge behind, always just out of sight. She learned their rhythms, their habits. Shaw was the cautious one, the planner. Finnegan was the hothead, the enforcer. They were a dangerous combination. She decided to separate them. She chose her ground near an old, abandoned way station, a collection of crumbling adobe walls and a dry well. She waited until Finnegan rode out on a short patrol, leaving Shaw alone in their camp. Then, she made her move. She used fire, the great purifier and agent of chaos. A single, well-placed flask of kerosene, and the dry grasslands around their camp went up in a sheet of flame, the wind whipping it into a frenzy. Shaw was caught completely by surprise. He scrambled to save their horses and supplies, his attention focused entirely on the fire. Abby, hidden in the rocks, had a clear shot, but she didn't take it. A clean death was too good for him. This needed to be a message. She waited until he had the horses clear, then put a single, deliberate Winchester round into the ground a foot from his boots. The bullet kicked up a spray of dirt, and the message was delivered: "I am here. I can kill you whenever I want." Shaw ducked for cover, firing his own rifle blindly into the rocks. A deadly game of cat and mouse began amidst the smoke and the flames. Abby was in her element. She was a phantom, her shots coming from a dozen different places, pinning him down, shredding his nerves. She wasn't trying to kill him. She was hurting him. She drove him away from his camp, away from the direction Finnegan would be returning from, and towards the abandoned way station. He took the bait, seeing the crumbling walls as his only hope for a defensible position. He scrambled inside, taking cover behind a collapsed wall, his rifle ready. He waited. The silence, broken only by the roar of the distant fire, stretched on. He scanned the rocks, expecting her to appear. He never thought to look up. Abby had circled around, climbed the back of the old station, and was now on the crumbling roof directly above him. "Looking for me?" she asked, her voice a calm, chilling whisper. Shaw looked up, his face a mask of pure terror. He saw her silhouette against the smoke-filled sky. He tried to raise his rifle, but it was too late. Abby fired her Colt, a single, downward shot. The hunt for Shaw was over. She was waiting when Finnegan returned, drawn by the smoke. She met him on the open plain. He saw her from a distance, a lone rider, waiting. He saw Shaw's horse, riderless, tied to the hitching post of the ruined station. He knew. He charged, screaming a wordless cry of rage, his revolver blazing. It was the charge of a man who knew he was already dead, a final, futile act of defiance. Abby did not move. She sat her horse, raised her own revolver, and took calm, deliberate aim. She fired once. Finnegan was thrown from his saddle, his charge ending in a cloud of dust. 5 down. Only Caleb remained. She searched the bodies. On Finnegan, she found nothing. It was tarnished and worn. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman. She was beautiful, with dark, sad eyes and a cascade of black hair. On the back, a single word was delicately engraved, Serafina. Abby stared at the locket, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Lefty Pete's dying words. Jed's warning. And now this. A picture of the woman, carried by one of Caleb's most trusted men. Why? She snapped the locket shut, her knuckles white. It meant nothing. It was a trinket. A coincidence. Her mind reeled, desperately trying to build a wall against the flood of doubt. This was another of Caleb's tricks, another piece of poison left for her to find, designed to unnerve her before their final confrontation. She put the locket in her own pocket, beside the worn wedding ring of her husband. She would keep it. She would carry this lie with her to Sangre de Cristo. And when she faced Caleb, she would throw it in his face, a symbol of his pathetic, failed attempts to break her. And then she would kill him. Her trail of blood and lies was leading her to its final, terrible destination. She was certain of her purpose, but for the first time, she was no longer certain of the truth that lay at its heart. The name of the border town, Sangre de Cristo, was a promise of blood. It was a place where 2 countries and a dozen cultures bled into one another, creating a chaotic, lawless settlement that answered to no flag but that of the almighty dollar. The air was thick with the smell of cheap tequila, frying pork, and the ever-present dust kicked up by the restless shuffle of men seeking fortune, escape, or a quick death. This was Caleb Kane's sanctuary, a place where a man's past could be bought, sold, or buried for the right price. And it was here that Abby's hunt would end. She arrived not as a warrior, but as a whisper. She sold her horse on the outskirts of town and entered on foot, a simple, black-clad woman, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, her guns concealed beneath a dusty poncho. She needed to understand the town before she made her move. She needed to find Caleb. She took a small, cheap room overlooking the main plaza, a room that smelled of stale cigar smoke and regret. From her window, she watched the lifeblood of the town pulse below. She saw the swagger of the gunmen, the desperation of the prospectors, the weary resilience of the merchants. And she listened. The name Serafina was not hard to find. It was spoken with a mixture of reverence and desire in the cantinas. She had been the star attraction at the town's largest and most opulent saloon, La Rosa Cantina. A singer, they said, with the voice of an angel and the eyes of a fallen one. She could make a man forget his own name with a single song, a grizzled old prospector told Abby, who was posing as a woman looking for work. And a man like Caleb Kane. He was not immune. Abby's heart grew colder with every word. She learned that Serafina had been Caleb's obsession. He had showered her with gifts, cleared the saloon of his rivals, made it known that she was his property. But, the story went, her heart had belonged to another. His own brother, the old man whispered, his eyes wide with the thrill of the gossip. The respectable one, Elias. He used to ride down here, they say, on business, but his real business was in Serafina's room above the cantina. It was a dangerous game they were playing. Abby felt a wave of nausea. She stood up, her hand on the silver locket in her pocket, and walked out of the saloon, the old man's words chasing her like ghosts. She had to see this woman. She had to look into the eyes of the person whose name had become a poison in her life. She went to La Rosa Cantina that night. It was a riot of noise and color, a stark contrast to the grim, silent world she now inhabited. A new singer was on the stage, but Abby's eyes were searching the crowd. She found her sitting alone at a small table in a shadowed corner, a glass of dark wine untouched before her. It had to be her. She matched the photograph in the locket perfectly. She wore a simple, elegant dress of deep crimson, and she possessed a sad, timeless beauty that made her stand out even in the boisterous room. Abby walked to the table, her movements slow and deliberate. Serafina looked up as her shadow fell over her, her dark, sorrowful eyes showing no surprise, only a deep, weary recognition. "You are Abigail Kane," Serafina said, her voice a low, melodic whisper. It was not a question. "And you are Serafina," Abby replied, her hand resting on the butt of her concealed Colt. "I have been expecting you," the singer said. "I knew one day the ghost of his past would come walking through my door." She gestured to the empty chair. "Will you not sit?" Abby remained standing. "I want to know why," she said, her voice tight, brittle. "Why my husband is dead." Serafina looked down at her wine glass. "You think you know why," she said softly. "You think he died because of a robbery, because of his brother's greed. You have been avenging a man who was a martyr to his own honor." She looked up then, and her eyes were filled with a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "You are wrong. He was a martyr to love. To our love." The words struck Abby with the force of a physical blow. "That's a lie," she hissed. "Is it?" Serafina asked. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out a thin, folded piece of paper. It was a letter. She pushed it across the table towards Abby. "His last letter to me. It arrived the day after he was killed. He wrote it the morning of the ambush." Abby stared at the letter as if it were cold snake. The handwriting was his. Unmistakable. Elegant and strong. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. "He was coming for me," Serafina whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "We were going to run away together. To California. He was going to tell you. That's what the letter says. He loved you, Abigail, in his own way. But he was in love with me. Caleb found out. He couldn't have me, so he made sure no one could. He killed his own brother not for the ranch, but out of a jealous rage." Abby unfolded the letter. The words, written in the hand of the man she had loved and killed for, swam before her tear-filled eyes. "My dearest Serafina, by the time you read this, I will be on my way. I have sold the last of the herd. The money will be enough for our new start. I will tell Abby tonight. It will be the hardest thing I have ever done, for she is a good woman and does not deserve this hurt. But a man cannot live a lie, and my truth is with you." The letter went on, full of plans and promises, a blueprint for a life that had been stolen from them both. A life that had been built on the ashes of her own. The saloon, the music, the peeplight all faded away. The world dissolved into a meaningless, roaring vortex of pain. The righteous fire that had fueled her, the sacred vow that had been her only purpose, it was all a lie. The foundation of her entire world, the memory of her husband's perfect love, had crumbled to dust. She had not been avenging a hero who died for her. She had been avenging a liar who had died for another woman. All the blood she had spilled, the men she had killed, the souls she had burned away. It had all been for nothing. For a cheap, sordid affair. She looked at Serafina, this beautiful, sad woman who was the cause of it all. She saw no hatred in her eyes, no triumph. Only a shared, profound loss. They were two women, bound together by their love for the same dead, faithless man. Abby crumpled the letter in her fist, stood up, and walked away without a word, leaving the singer in the red dress alone with her wine and her grief. Abby stumbled out into the dusty, chaotic street of Sangre de Cristo, a ghost in a world that no longer made any sense, her heart not just broken, but annihilated. All that was left was the final, meaningless act of a vengeance that had already turned to ash in her mouth. The night after the revelation in the cantina was a new kind of hell for Abigail. The grief for her husband was gone, burned away and replaced by the cold, bitter ashes of betrayal. The rage that had been her constant companion now felt hollow, directionless. She had been a vessel of righteous fury, but now she was just empty. She sat in her small, dark room, the crumpled letter from Elias on the table, a testament to her magnificent, bloody folly. She had killed 5 men. She had turned herself from a loving wife into a cold-blooded killer, all in the name of a lie. The faces of the men she had shot down paraded through her mind. Had they known? Had they all known? Was their dying laughter not just cruelty, but the mockery of a woman who was the last to know the truth? Lefty Pete's words echoed in her ears. He didn't die for you. It had not been a dying man's poison. It had been a dying man's pity. For a moment, she thought of ending it, of taking her coat and following her false idol into the great, empty darkness. What was left to live for? Her love was a lie, her vengeance a sham. She was a murderer with no cause. But as she held the cold, heavy steel of the revolver in her hand, something else rose from the ashes of her despair. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was a cold, hard, and utterly final sense of purpose. She had been a fool. She had been deceived by 2 brothers. One had betrayed her with his love, the other with his hate. Elias was beyond her reach now, a ghost to be dealt with in the quiet, desolate courts of her own memory. But Caleb was still alive. Her mission was no longer about avenging a fallen hero. It was about settling a final, personal debt. Caleb Kane had not just murdered her husband, he had been the architect of this entire, devastating lie. He had allowed her to go on her bloody rampage, perhaps even enjoyed the irony of it, knowing she was killing for a man who had cuckolded them both. He had taken her husband, her home, her love, her innocence, and her very reason for being. He had left her with nothing. And for that, he had to die. This was no longer about justice. It was about erasure. She would wipe the name of Cain from the face of the earth, starting with him, and ending with the woman she had become. The next day, she did not hide. She did not sneak. She walked down the main street of Sangre de Cristo in the broad, harsh light of the afternoon sun, her poncho cast aside, her décolleté sitting low and ready on her hips. The fire was gone from her eyes, replaced by something far more terrifying and absolute, chilling emptiness. She was a walking ghost, a woman with nothing left to lose, and that made her the most dangerous thing in the lawless town. The whispers followed her. The gunmen and the gamblers who had filled the streets seemed to melt away before her, sensing the aura of death that clung to her like a shroud. She walked directly to the front of La Rosa Cantina, Caleb's unofficial fortress, and stopped in the middle of the dusty street. Caleb, her voice was not a shout, but it carried with the clear, sharp authority of a death sentence. Caleb Kane, face me. Or are you as much of a coward as the brother you murdered? The swinging doors of the cantina were pushed open, and Caleb emerged. He was flanked by 2 of his last remaining thugs, but he motioned for them to stay back. He was dressed in black, a mirror image of the brother he had killed, but his face was gone, his eyes holding the wild, paranoid light of a man who had been hunted for too long. He saw Abby standing alone in the street, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. So, the grieving widow finally comes to call, he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. I have to admit, you've been more entertaining than I ever imagined. Did you enjoy your little war? Did it make you feel righteous, killing all those men for a man who was packing his bags to leave you for a whore? The words were meant to be daggers, to wound her, to throw her off balance. They had no effect. Abby's face remained a cold, emotionless mask. This is not about him anymore, she said, her voice as flat and dead as the plains. This is about you and me. This is about the end of the story. Caleb laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, I agree. He took a step forward, into the street, his own hands hovering over the matched pair of revolvers on his hips. The story ends with you in the dirt, right next to the memory of your faithless husband. The town of Sangre de Cristo held its breath. The street cleared as if by magic. Windows were shuttered. Doors were bolted. This was a final, terrible sacrament, and no one wanted to be caught in the fallout. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows down the street. The two last Canes faced each other, two dark figures in a landscape of dust and dying light. The wind picked up, swirling the red duster on their boots. It was a scene painted in blood and vengeance, the final act of a tragedy that had been written long ago. The confrontation was at hand. The only thing left was the drawing of the guns. The street in Sangre de Cristo was a silent, dusty stage, set for the final act. The setting sun, a great, bloody eye in the western sky, painted the scene in apocalyptic hues of orange and red. The wind whispered through the empty street, a mournful chorus for the violence to come. Abigail and Caleb stood 50 paces apart, two statues carved from hatred and grief. For Abby, the world had narrowed to this single point. The town, the whispers, the heartbreaking letter, it had all faded away, leaving only the man who was the architect of her ruin. Caleb, for his part, saw not a broken woman, but the culmination of all his jealousies. She was the last piece of his brother's life that he had yet to destroy. He savored the moment, the absolute power he felt as he looked at the woman who had single-handedly dismantled his entire gang. "You have his eyes, you know," Caleb said, his voice a low, conversational tone that carried easily in the silence. "That same stupid, noble look. He looked at me just like that, right before I killed him. A look of shocked betrayal, as if he couldn't believe his own brother would put him down for stealing what was rightfully mine." "Nothing was ever yours, Caleb," Abby replied, her voice a dead calm. "You only know how to take, to spoil. You're a disease. And you were the cure he was running from," Caleb sneered. "He was coming to me, you know, the day he died, to buy my silence, to give me the ranch, everything, in exchange for letting him and his cantina singer run away. But I don't like being bought. I prefer to take." Every word was another twist of the knife, another confirmation of the lie she had lived. But the pain no longer registered. It had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, clear, and empty space. There was nothing left inside her but the mission. "Are you done talking?" she asked. Caleb's smile vanished, replaced by the ugly, reptilian focus of a killer. "I am." There was no signal, no count. There was only a shared, primal understanding that the time for words was over. Their hands moved in a blur, a synchronized dance of death that had been inevitable from the moment of the first betrayal. But there was a difference. Caleb was fast, his movements born of a lifetime of violence and intimidation. Abby was something else. She was not just fast, she was fluid, certain, her movements honed by months of relentless, single-minded training, fueled by a purpose that had been purified into its most essential, lethal form. Her Colt was clear of the holster a fraction of a second before his. The setting sun glinted off the blued steel. Two shots rang out, so close together they sounded almost as one. A red flower blossomed on Caleb's shoulder, spinning him half around. His own shot went wild, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to Abby's left. He staggered, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated his brother's love for another woman. It was a fatal habit. He tried to bring his other gun to bear, his hand clumsy now, his movements slowed by the shock of the bullet. Abby did not give him the chance. She took a steadying step forward, brought her second Colt up, and fired again. The second shot was not aimed at his shoulder. It was aimed at his heart. Caleb was thrown backward, his body lifted from the ground for a moment by the sheer force of the impact. He landed in a crumpled heap in the red dust, the setting sun casting his long, final shadow down the empty street. Silence. Abby stood, both guns smoking in her hands, her posture unwavering. She was a statue of vengeance, her face an unreadable mask. The doors and windows of the town began to open. Faces peered out, their expressions a mixture of terror and awe. They had witnessed the end of the Cain brothers, the end of an era of fear. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards Caleb's body. She stood over him, looking down at the man who had been the focal point of her entire existence for so long. He was just a man, bleeding his life into the thirsty sand. His eyes were open, staring up at the sky, a final, unasked question in them. She felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, no satisfaction. The great, roaring fire inside her had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of an empty purpose. She believed it was over. She believed her husband, the man she thought she knew, had finally been avenged. But the greatest, most painful wound was yet to be delivered. The town of Sangre de Cristo remained in a state of suspended animation. The people watched in a hushed, reverent silence as the lone woman stood over the body of the man who had been their tyrant. They saw a legend, a gunslinging widow who had single-handedly brought down an entire gang. They did not see a woman whose entire world was a hollow, echoing chamber of lies. Abby's gaze was fixed on Caleb's lifeless form. The driving force of her life, the singular purpose that had gotten her out of bed each morning and pushed her through the pain of her training, was now a cooling corpse in the dust. The emptiness she felt was vast and terrifying. She had expected catharsis, a sense of peace. Instead, she felt as if she had been hollowed out, leaving only a fragile, brittle shell. Her eyes fell on Caleb's coat pocket. A piece of paper, folded and stained with a dark, spreading patch of his blood, was sticking out. Perhaps it was a map to his stolen fortune. Perhaps it was a list of his other Confederates. Some primal, investigative instinct, the last remnant of her long hunt, compelled her to reach down. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled the letter from his pocket. It felt warm, damp. She unfolded it. The paper was creased and worn, as if it had been read many times. The handwriting, however, was as clear and familiar as her own reflection. It was Elias's hand. Strong, elegant, unmistakable. Her heart, a thing she thought had been turned to stone, gave a painful, violent lurch. It was a letter. From her husband. Why would Caleb, his murderer, carry a letter from him? Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and the ground seemed to fall away from beneath her feet. My dearest Serafina. The world tilted. The air grew thin. She had seen these words before, in the copy Serafina had shown her. But this was the original. The ink was faded, the paper soft with handling. This was the letter Elias had written on the last morning of his life. She sank to her knees in the dusty street, oblivious to the watching eyes of the town, oblivious to everything but the devastating words on the page. She read on, her mind struggling to accept the brutal, undeniable truth. By the time you read this, I will be on my way. I have sold the last of the herd. The money will be enough for our new start. I will tell Abby tonight. It will be the hardest thing I have ever done, for she is a good woman and does not deserve this hurt. But a man cannot live a lie, and my truth is with you. I have tried to love her as she deserves, but my heart has been yours since that first night I heard you sing. The letter detailed their plans to escape to California, to build a new life together, a life that was a secret, a betrayal. It spoke of a love so profound that it made Abby's own marriage seem like a pale, polite imitation. And then came the final, soul-destroying paragraph. Caleb knows. I do not know how, but he knows. He confronted me. He is mad with jealousy. He has given me an ultimatum, the ranch, the money, everything, in exchange for his silence and for you. I am to meet him on the trail today to give him my answer. He thinks I will pay him off. He is wrong. I will not sell you, my love, not for any price. I will face him. I will make him understand. And then I will be on my way to you. Wait for me at the mission. We will be free. It all clicked into place. The ambush. It wasn't a robbery. It was a confrontation between two brothers over a woman. Elias had not died defending his home or his wife. He had died in a foolish, romantic attempt to protect his mistress. His last words to her, "I'm sorry, Abby," were not an apology for his death. They were a confession. The entire foundation of her existence, her perfect marriage, her righteous vengeance, her sacred vow was a lie. A cheap, sordid, and pathetic lie. She had killed 6 men. She had turned herself into a monster. She had waded through a river of blood, all to avenge a man who had died for a secret love, a love that was not hers. The irony was a physical, crushing weight, squeezing the very air from her lungs. The men she had killed, the ones who had hinted at the truth, they had not been lying to wound her. They had been telling her truth. She had been too blind, too consumed by her own righteous narrative, to see. A sound escaped her lips, a raw, broken, and human noise. It was the sound of a soul shattering. She looked at the body of Caleb, the man she had just killed, and saw not a villain, but the final, bloody punctuation mark on a story of love and betrayal in which she had only ever been a supporting character. Her entire war, her epic journey of vengeance, had been nothing more than a violent footnote in another woman's love story. The world, which had been a clear, stark landscape of black and white, right and wrong, dissolved into an incomprehensible, meaningless gray. She was adrift in an ocean of despair, with no land, no stars, no truth to guide her. The vengeance was complete, and it had cost her everything, for nothing. The sun had finally died, its last light bleeding from the sky, leaving the street of Sangre de Cristo in a state of bruised twilight. The townspeople, sensing that the true, terrible drama was not yet over, remained in the shadows, watching the lone woman who knelt in the dust. They saw a victor, but they could feel the aura of a defeat more profound than any simple death. Abigail did not move for a long time. She knelt before the body of her final victim, the letter from her dead husband clutched in her hand. The paper was a fragile, damning testament to the lie she had built her new life upon. Each word was a ghost, mocking her, whispering of a love that was never hers, of a sacrifice made for another. The emptiness inside her was a living thing, a cold, vast desert. The fire of her vengeance, the thing that had kept her warm in the lonely nights and focused her aim in the heat of battle, had been extinguished so completely that she wondered if she would ever feel anything again. There was no grief, no rage. There was only the quiet, crushing weight of a hollow, meaningless victory. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. Her movements were stiff, the movements of an old woman, though her body was still young. She folded the letter, the sharp creases a final act of punctuation on a story she wished had never been written. She did not look at Caleb's body again. She did not look at the watching town. She turned and began to walk, her steps unsteady at first, then finding a slow, rhythmic, and final purpose. She walked away from the scene of her last kill, away from the center of the town, towards the open, empty plains that stretched out into the encroaching darkness. She walked until the last of the town's lights were just a faint, flickering memory behind her. She stopped at the edge of the vast, dark expanse, the cool night wind a gentle, indifferent touch on her face. This was the edge of her old world, the beginning of nothing. From a small pouch on her belt, she took out a match. She struck it on the heel of her boot, the sudden flare of the sulphur a small, defiant star in the overwhelming darkness. The tiny flame danced, casting a warm, flickering glow on her pale, emotionless face. She held the corner of Elias's letter to the flame. The paper caught, curling at the edges, turning black. The ink, his beautiful, familiar handwriting, blazed for a moment. The words of love and betrayal and promises were turning to gray, weightless ash. She watched it burn, her expression unchanging. She was not just burning a letter. She was burning a memory. She was burning the man she thought she had married. She was burning the righteous woman who had avenged him. She was burning the very idea of a love that could be trusted, a truth that could be counted on. She held the flaming missive until the heat licked at her fingertips, and then she let it drop. It fell to the dust, a small, dying fire, a funeral pyre for a lie. She stood for a moment longer, a lone figure outlined against the sea of stars. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and walked away from the last ember of her past, disappearing into the vast, dark, and empty horizon. The people of the territory would never know the truth. They would only have the legend. They would tell the story of the widow Cain, the relentless avenger who had single-handedly destroyed her husband's killers. They would speak of her cold eyes and her deadly aim. But the truest part of the story, the part that would be whispered in the quietest corners, was how it ended. They would say she completed her quest, and then simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but the ashes of a forgotten love. They would tell the tale of the widow who burned love with vengeance, a ghost who now rode the lonely trails of the West, forever a part of the twilight she had chosen for herself.